All right, Rick, you ready? All right, if you just walked in, please grab something to eat over on the wall and find a seat anywhere. There's no assigned seating. I want to introduce to you board members and longtime friends of the Partnership for Safe Medicines, Rick Roberts and Marv Shepherd.
Good afternoon. As Shabbir said, my name is Rick Roberts. I teach at the University of San Francisco, but that's not what I'm doing here. I'm here today because I am a survivor of counterfeit medicine, twice. In 2000, they found fake counterfeit drug called Serostim in the United States, and I'm not sure what the odds are, but I received both of them from my local pharmacy. I went to my pharmacy and picked up my first batch. I injected it every day. It felt a little odd where I injected it, but nothing alarming. And so the next month I went back to my pharmacy and got my second batch, and I injected that, and the burning sensation was gone, but the amount of liquid in the bottle was different. So the next time I went in, I stopped and I asked my pharmacist and asked him what was going on, and he said, "You should check, you may have gotten the fake stuff." And I went home, and sure enough, I had the fake stuff, 2 different batches made by 2 different sets of bad guys. And none of them were drugs that are used to treat HIV, which is what I was supposed to be using them for. And so at that point, my doctor and I had a problem. She said, "We know that you didn't get the medicine you needed for 2 months. The question is, what did you inject into your body? And is there something we need to do?" And it was an agonizing 6 months while the FDA did their analysis and investigation before I could find out what it was I had injected into my body. And one was a very small dose of a drug similar to the one I wanted or needed, and then the other was a synthetic hormone substitute that had nothing to do with what I needed. And it was found in 7 states, counterfeited in major pharmacy chains: California, Ohio, Kentucky, Michigan, New Jersey, Florida, and Missouri. It took us a while to figure it out, but we did, and that's why I'm still here and able to talk to you today. Not everyone has been so fortunate with their encounters with counterfeit meds. And I'm not the only one here today who's been directly impacted by this issue. So we have with us a number of surviving family members, and I'm going to ask them to stand as I go through so we can recognize your loss and also your bravery for sharing your story and helping us fight this epidemic of counterfeits. And so, oh, that's me. Okay, not so important. Here we go. More important. Joe Patterson pulled a muscle at the gym and died after taking a counterfeit oxycodone pill sold to him by a friend. Sadly, Joe never got to meet his son, Joseph Gabriel, who died Joe died before he was born. Yes. And Lisa's now raising him, and so Lisa, Joe's mother, is with us today. Lisa, would you stand again?
I'm sorry.
This is Lisa, Joe's mother. Maggie, Davina Crowley. She died after taking a counterfeit oxycodone pill made with fentanyl that a co-worker sold to her. In this case, a doctor in Vero Beach, Florida, who made the pill was convicted and received a life sentence. Caroline, Maggie's sister, is here representing the entire Davina family. Caroline, thank you for being here. Andrea's daughter Ashley died in her hometown of Grand Junction, Colorado, after taking a fake oxycodone pill made with fentanyl. Andrea appears here today with Deanne Hopkins And they're the founders of Voices for Awareness Foundation. And Andrea will be speaking on our second panel today, so you'll get to hear from her. But Andrea, would you please stand? And again, thank you for being here today. Jerome Butler. He was one of 14 people who died in the Sacramento area within the span of 1 month from a counterfeit Norco containing fentanyl. 38 others in the area were poisoned. Jerome was a devoted son and a father to his 3 children. His mother, Natasha, joins us today. Natasha, thank you for being here. Robbie Hodge died after ingesting a counterfeit Xanax pill sold to him by someone he went to high school with. His mother continues to run the nonprofit they found together, Realty for Rehab. Jennifer is here with us today. Jennifer, where are you? Please stand. Thank you for being here. Josh Holton believed what a journalist told him in a TED Talk, and that was that the dark net marketplaces were safe. You could read the reviews and know that something might be bad or good based on the reviews. So despite purchasing from a seller who had a lot of positive reviews, the Xanax pills sold to Josh and his friends were fakes made with fentanyl. Josh's mother and grandmothers are here to represent him today. If all 3 of you could stand, please. Thank you for all being here. Eric Griffin was a victim of counterfeit Xanax. The pill that killed Eric contained fentanyl. Eric's family, including his son and daughter, continue to miss him every day. And we'd just like to acknowledge him and his mother, Nicole, who isn't with us today, but would like us to recognize the loss she has, or has had to go through losing Eric. So I want to thank you all for coming. I'm certain I speak for everyone in the room when we commend you on your bravery and express our condolences for your losses. I know it's been a difficult couple of days, but we've all benefited from you sharing your stories and helping us in this fight against counterfeits. So thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to kick off this meeting with a short video, and then I'll introduce myself and get started, okay? Can we have the video, please?
Congressman David Kustoff, and I represent Tennessee's 8th Congressional District, and that includes parts of Memphis and also West Tennessee. In my district and also across the nation, families and communities are being torn apart by the opioid crisis. And we know that's creating challenges for both law enforcement and also for first responders. For the past several years, the TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, has reported an increase in counterfeit prescription drugs fueling the opioid epidemic. Counterfeit pills may look like genuine prescription drugs, but we know that they contain dangerous ingredients like fentanyl. Accidental inhalation or ingestion of even a small amount of fentanyl can cause an overdose. In 2017, 2 years ago, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention reported about 1,200 Tennesseans died of opioids. To me, and I know to all of you, this statistic is shocking and disturbing. That's why I'm introducing the CAST Act. Act, and that stands for Criminalizing Abused Substance Template Act. This bill is going to provide stricter penalties against possession of these harmful counterfeit drugs or paraphernalia. It's also going to make possession of a pill press mold with the intent to counterfeit Schedule 1 or 2 substances a federal crime. And the penalty could be a 20-year prison sentence. The CAST Act's increased penalties will help combat the illegal drug market and the danger it presents to people across the nation. I'm glad to introduce and take the lead in introducing this important legislation in Congress. And I also want to offer my sincere thanks to the Partnership for Safe Medicine for hosting the event today. I really appreciate the hard work that all of you do to combat the opioid crisis in our nation. May God bless you all.
As I mentioned, my name is Marv Shepherd. I'm the president or the chairman of the board of directors for the Partnership of Safe Medicines. I've been on the board for 16 years, and this is our 16th year of operating the Partnership for Safe Medicines. We are a coalition of groups, and this slide shows some of the groups that we're a coalition with. We're patient advocate organizations, healthcare professionals, wholesalers, manufacturers that are concerned about the dangers of counterfeit medications to American patients. We're unique because we bring together groups that usually don't agree well on anything, but they do agree on this. And that's an important concept to think about. We got one commonality. They agree on fighting counterfeit drugs. But they agree that counterfeits are clear and present growing danger in America to Americans, and that we should be tightening the supply chain and not loosening the supply chain at all. If you'd like to join me, you could join this group if you represent an association or a group would like to be part of PSM. Please see Shabbir, and he's standing right over there, and he'll be glad to add you to the thing. We do have a website. It's called www.safemedicines.org, and we have a weekly newsletter, and it's free. You can access the website. You'll get the newsletter just by putting in your email address, and you can get all the highlights of what happened the last week. I think it comes out on Tuesday mornings, if I remember right. So the newsletter does. I'm pleased to announce that in 2019, this last year, we added 19 new organizations to the PSM list. And these organizations are assisting us in our fight and education about counterfeit pharmaceuticals. This slide shows that in 2017, we released a report, the first in the nation to look at the deaths of counterfeit pills made with fentanyl. Fentanyl is 100 times more powerful than morphine, and it doesn't take very much fentanyl to kill you. If you look at your salt shaker at home, you take out one flake of it, one grain of it, and that's what would kill you. It's so powerful that it will do it to you. At that time, there were 40 states that had seized these deadly pills, and 16 states reported residents have died from taking them. Every few months, the number has grown. As of July, when this map was updated, fake prescription pills have been found in 48 states and killed people in 33 states. Already, this map is out of date with the recent discovery of counterfeit pill in a tablet in Delaware, and the current crisis stands at counterfeit prescription pills now in 49 states, and 37 have documented fatalities due to the fentanyl pills. These pills just look exactly like the Xanax or oxycodone or Norco that you would find in a licensed pharmacy. The people who take them often believe that they're taking the same dose as their Xanax they had taken before, but now it's been laced with fentanyl. They are manufactured usually pretty poorly. When you realize the small quantity of fentanyl that will kill you, they're not like making chocolate chip cookies, where you just throw the chips in and mix it the batter and out it comes. To make these pills, you really have to have precise equipment, get the right flow of the powder right, and the right tablet press to do them. It's not an easy task, and that's why we have skilled professionals in the pharmaceutical industry that do that, not somebody in their garage or basement or back seat of their car making the pills. I'm pleased to say that yesterday a research paper was released that I authored. You know, I'm a retired professor after 37 years in academia and just retired out of University of Texas in Austin. And you still can't get research out of your blood as being a professor who has multiple publications like I have. So I'm still dabble in it, and I got asked to write this paper on the impact of drug importation on Canada. He says that seems to be a very popular topic now, and a lot of people think that I'd be able to get safe drugs out of Canada, and so they went to look at it. I did the paper in 2010, and I did another paper in 2015 that looked at the same issue. And I said no, I wasn't going to do another one until this administration decided to go with the pathways for drug importation, and that's when I changed my mind and said, let's look at it again. And I used 2018 data, and it's the most recent data I could find on U.S. prescriptions and Canadian prescriptions at that time. So my research on the size of Canada and its drug supply and how importation will cause shortages in Canada was just released as of yesterday. And the newest paper shows that 20% of the Americans source their prescription drugs out of Canada. Canada would be out of prescription drugs in about 162 days. And you look at the next slide, it shows the variation in the percent of drugs coming from Canada if the United States wanted to do it. They get their drugs out of Canada. First thing you got to understand is that Canada is pretty small, 34 million people versus 360 million. So it's 1/10 the size, basically, of the United States. So it wouldn't take long. It wouldn't take very many United States citizens getting their drugs out of Canada before you would put their supply in jeopardy. It wouldn't take long at all. And with the new proposal of commercial importations, I decided to look at it a little bit more differently. In the first papers, I said it was 20%. If 20% of the U.S. prescriptions came out of Canada, this would be the impact. Now, with commercial importation, which means U.S. wholesalers, U.S. pharmacies, CVS, Walgreens, whatever they want, governments, Medicaid programs by state governments, and individuals could buy their drugs out of Canada. So now I think the 20% is a low average. So I looked at in my papers based on 40%. We'll double it. See, if 40% of U.S. prescriptions dispensed last year, and we dispensed 4 billion of them. Canada spent 660 million. Think of that, a year. Huge difference, huge difference. But if 40% of U.S. prescriptions were sourced out of Canada, we would exhaust their 2018 drug supply in 118 days. So they'll have to find, if that ever happens, they'll have to find another source for pharmaceuticals, whether it's more importation for them or whether they increase their manufacturing. So let's get on to the next group of objectives we want to do, and I think this slide pretty well points out what we want to do. This is what we're going to cover today. It's going to be a good learning exercise for all in the room, because you're going to hear from professionals from all types of people and industries, from the distribution chain to the victims, as we heard earlier, to the control and government control of pharmaceuticals. But how track and trace protects our medicine supply. We have a professional that knows a tremendous lot of information on what is track and trace and how it works in track and tracing pharmaceuticals. What Canadian patients and law enforcement thinks about drug importation. How criminals, both foreign and domestic, access to drug supply. How the criminal mind works and develops the counterfeits, and what is like personally to be touched by a counterfeit medication, as you met some of the parents and folks of the close ones that lost their lives this morning. So let's get started, and I'll turn it over to my boss.
Oh. I don't believe the Green Beret ever has another boss. So could I have panel one join me on the stage while I introduce us for a second? So, and while the AV people do their job. So I have been the executive director of the Partnership for Safe Medicine since 2017 and working for it since 2010. And I spend a lot of time working with policymakers around the country, and this year what they wanted to talk about was Canadian importation. Okay, that's fine. And I noticed that every time we had these conversations, when I testify in places like Florida or Colorado or Maine, there was a dearth of Canadians in the room. In fact, the Canadians that were in the room often were like the Canadian that I brought, because I felt like somebody should hear from Canadians if we're going to do Canadian importation. And so I thought today it would be really useful if I brought a couple of Canadians. And so if we're going to do importation from Canada, let's actually ask the other half of this transaction how they feel about it. They may have some concerns about supply, as you could gather from Marv, but there's a larger concern that I and every person in this room who is an American should share, which is something we have learned from the opioid crisis. When there is a demand for a product and that product is not available, someone will still sell it to you. Every law enforcement officer or former law officer in this room will tell you that that is true. That it doesn't matter that you can't get Xanax, someone will make a fake Xanax. It doesn't matter what it is that you're asking for. No one's going to go home and say we couldn't get any. Someone will be around to sell it to you if there's money to be made. And there is a lot of money to be made in what we're talking about. And so that's my concern with safely doing importation, is that I'm not sure that if it's ever presented as unsafe, if there's an unavailability, that we won't have criminals coming who will say, well, I've got Canadian labeled medication for you, and that the wrong person will turn a blind eye to the risks inherent, and then what we'll get will be counterfeits. So today I'm going to have three people who I think should be a part of any conversation about importation involved to talk to us. First is Dirk Rogers, who's an expert in track and trace, and you should read his blog, rxtrace.com, which is over 10 years old now, right? It's a very long-running blog. We're going to hear from John Adams, who is a Canadian patient advocate in Canada, who runs a volunteer chair for a very large patient coalition there. And then Don Bell, who is a career Canadian law enforcement, who can talk a little about their experience. Let's start with Dirk. Dirk, can you tell us a little bit about track and trace?
Thanks, Shabbir. I also wrote the book, The Drug Supply Chain Security Act Explained. In fact, my interest in this topic is about the regulatory requirements. And in fact, most of my consulting clients are companies who are in the supply chain trying to figure out how to meet the requirements of the regulation. I've been following these regulations and the laws for quite a while now, ever since In the early 2000s, when Florida created their own regulation, California created one, and eventually in a year or two, 30 states had created their own separate regulation for tracking and tracing drugs. So that's why the Drug Supply Chain Security Act was eventually created to sort of standardize and have a single approach across the whole country. So I wanted to start off with some of the reasons that these laws were necessary, because there was a real problem back in the early 2000s. It started in the early 2000s. And this is one example taken from Catherine E. Bond's book, Dangerous Doses. In 2002, down on the very bottom of the slide on the right-hand side, you'll see Timothy Fagan was a 16-year-old organ transplant patient who needed life-saving medicines. He bought the medicine he needed for anti-rejection from CVS, his local pharmacy, and it turned out to be counterfeit. An interesting thing about this, similar to Rick's story, CVS called him the day after, called him and said, we believe what you're taking is counterfeit. Would you bring it in? We'll give you a good one. So he brought it in, gave him a good one. The next day they called him up and say, stop, don't take that one either, because that one's counterfeit too. And so they exchanged it and finally got him some good medicine. He was able to survive. But you see, the blocks above this diagram are all of the places in the supply chain in Florida where that drug was bought and sold illegally. Most of them are not licensed, but some of these boxes are licensed wholesalers, or they were licensed, even though they were really kind of dealing in criminal product, counterfeit product. So this is an example of how illegitimate products made it into the legitimate supply chain where unsuspecting folks from around the United States could actually buy them and become a victim unknowingly. Here's another one. This is counterfeit Avastin, which I believe is a cancer medication. This was in the press quite a bit. On the far right, you have physicians who are administering the drug that they received from their U.S. licensed wholesale distributor. But that wholesale distributor bought it illegally from one in the UK, who bought it or actually, I don't know if it was illegal, but they bought it from a Danish distributor, who bought it from a Swiss distributor, who bought it from an Egyptian distributor, and before that, we don't know exactly where it came from. This was brought out in the investigations by the FDA and others. The only reason we knew this was coming into the United States is the UK distributor got cold feet and called the MHRA, the regulator in the UK, and they called the FDA and said, you might want to check this wholesaler in the United States. So in the lower left-hand corner, this was a probable or potential victim of this medication. Betty Hunter was taking Avastin and did receive some of the lot numbers from this particular case. She passed away from cancer. Whether or not she was untimely death was caused by getting fake drug that didn't have any efficacy at all, or whether it was just the cancer that was too strong, it's impossible to say. But she's a known victim involved in this case. Here's another case. Levemir is a fast-acting insulin. And it has to be refrigerated very carefully, very tight tolerances on the refrigeration. But a load of it was stolen after it left the manufacturer, M, in the upper left-hand corner. It was stolen, a whole truckload of drugs. One pallet worth was the Levemir, which mysteriously showed up at a wholesale distributor who had a license in South Carolina. I think it was North or South Carolina. That's W1, wholesaler number 1. Who sold some of it to licensed wholesaler number 2, who sold some of it to licensed wholesaler number 3. Now, wholesaler 3 sold some of it to CDS, which is CDS stands for chain drugstore. The chain drugstore then distributed it to physicians or pharmacies, actually, in their chain. And it made it out to patients who started having adverse reaction typical of the kind of reaction you'd have if the Levemir was not stored and refrigerated properly. And when they did the investigation and tracked it back, they found out that wholesaler number 3 was totally legitimate. They were in Maryland. They required which required a pedigree at that time. But at that time, pedigrees were paper. And it's very easy to create a fake pedigree when it's just a piece of paper. You can do it with Microsoft Word very easily. So it fulfilled the law at the time in Maryland, and they felt pretty comfortable. They got a really good deal, though. Then when they continued investing, they found out that wholesaler number 2 being licensed, they mostly were legitimate, but they occasionally would dip in and start buying stuff that they knew was illegitimate or that they suspected was illegitimate. Wholesaler number 1 in this case admitted they never bought legitimate drugs. They only dealt in counterfeit drugs or illegitimate drugs, in this case stolen. And so most of those folks went to jail. So these are the kind of problems that were happening back in the 2000s. And this is why the states were creating their regulations. And this is why eventually the federal government, Congress, stepped in and created the standard for the whole country, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And the way it works is, this is amazing to take this huge law that spans 10 years into 3 or 4 bullets. It's very difficult to do, so sorry, Shabbir. But this is all I came up with. So first of all supply chain participants have to be licensed, which you would expect that would be not surprising, right? Well, not all states had regulations, and so not all states had a requirement for registration. Well, now we do. It's the same one that covers the whole country. Drugs are going to be and are serialized with a 2D barcode for the first time, starting last November. The drugs you get most likely are not going to be serialized because you get them from the pharmacy. The DSCSA goes from the manufacturer through what they call the back door of the pharmacy. So that's where these packages are serialized. And the serial number makes it much easier to document the track and trace and the history of those drugs. The third bullet, the law requires standardized transaction documentation that must be provided by the seller to the buyer. And both companies, the seller and the buyer, must save those documents for 6 years in case there's an investigation. And they must be retrievable so that if there is an investigation, they can retrieve them within 24 hours and provide that documentation. So it's not quite a pedigree, but it's standardized, and it includes enough evidence that you would be in a lot of trouble if you forged it, like they did in the case of one of these examples I was just talking about. So, in fact, there are 3 types of transaction documents. I'm only going to cover really quickly one of those documents because it has to do, it's where I think that any proposal for importation from Canada or anywhere else is really going to be in trouble just meeting the documentation requirement. So if I'm focusing on letters C, E, and G. So C says that the the seller received transaction information and a transaction statement from the prior owner of the product as required by the DSCSA. If you're in Canada and you're selling drugs to a customer in the United States in the supply chain under one of these proposed regulations, you're not going to be able to answer that question. You're not going to be able to make that assertion because the Canadian drugs don't require these assertions. They do not require the other transaction documentation, and so you cannot make that assertion. That means the customer in the United States cannot accept your drugs because they must, under the DSCSA, receive this documentation when they buy the drugs. Letter E, the seller had systems and processes in place to comply with verification requirements under the DSCSA. Verification requirements are very tightly explained in the DSCSA, and if you're in Canada, you're not prepared to verify drugs that way. One reason you're just not prepared is that you're not required to, but also the verification requires verifying the NDC, which is an American number, and the serial number of the drug packages. Which, when you're buying in Canada, are not going to have the serial number or the NDC because it's a Canadian drug. So you can't fulfill that requirement as well. The last one, did not knowingly alter the transaction history. Well, The transaction history won't even be defined because you didn't have the standardized documents from the manufacturer when you're in Canada, because the manufacturer isn't required to give those to you. So there's some real problems trying to meet some of the DSCSA, and this is just one of the set of issues that the DSCSA imposes on proposals to do importation in the United States. So importation is unsafe and cannot meet. That's my whole point. These are just a couple of more bullets about it. So the DSCSA tracing begins with the original manufacturer and documents the full chain of ownership. And that includes, some of the proposals have repackaging operations. The DSCSA does allow repackaging, but the repackager must buy drugs that are serialized from the manufacturer, by the manufacturer, and then they must put a new serial number and NDC on and link in their database their serial number and NDC with the original manufacturer's serial number and NDC, so that there's a full traceability all right through the repackaging operation. This is something that will not be possible by a repackaging that's simply doing for the first time, putting a NDC and serial number on drugs just to meet the DSA from that point on. It didn't meet it at the beginning of the supply chain. You cannot start it in the middle of the supply chain. Drugs from foreign markets don't use the same identifiers. This is the NDC, the National Drug Code that I'm talking about. And the result is we have no reliable record of the drug, where the drug was and who handled it before it enters the United States. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but basically the title says it all. It would be expensive because the industry has spent so much money now. In the middle of the 10-year rollout, we're not done yet. 2023 is the end point of the rollout of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. So, Shabbir, I'm going to turn it back over.
Thank you. While we're waiting for John to make his way the enormous 12 feet up here, I have just one question for you, Dirk, which is, you're probably one of the few people on the planet who's actually read the entire Drug Supply Chain Security Act, and I'm sure you've gotten great sleep as a result of it. But are the requirements in it waivable by the executive branch in any way, or are they hard-coded into the law? Can an administration that decided that they wanted to do Canadian importation in violation of it just make it go away with an executive order?
No, they can't. The regulations are very, I think, clearly defined. It's a law passed by Congress. I think the only way to perhaps modify it would be to go back to Congress and get Congress to sanction whatever changes. But it's a safety law. It's designed to protect patients in the United States. And so for Congress to weaken the law to allow importation would effectively weaken it so that it would threaten all patients in the United States, not just those who want to buy drugs from Canada or elsewhere.
Thank you. John, give us the perspective from Canada.
Okay. All right. There we go. I'm the guy who loves to come to Washington, D.C., and with the name that's really hard for most Americans to remember, John. First of all, I need to say that most Canadians think that we're pretty good neighbors and pretty good friends with most Americans. And sometimes you need a really good friend to tell you you're dealing with a bad idea. And that's what I'm here as a really good friend to share with you today. And also, it's not just me. I am going to give the patient perspective on this, but I received a message from the Canadian Embassy, and I'm authorized to share it with you. And it says, in part, here's the pith and substance, is, should any external or international actions adversely affect the supply or costs of prescription drugs for Canadians, Canada would have no choice, but to respond to protect human health in Canada. That's a message for you today from the Government of Canada, transmitted through the Canadian Embassy to me and authorized to share with you. Now, from a patient point of view, and I'm one of those patients, the Best Medicines Coalition, 28 national organizations. Our first issue is safety. Our second issue is effectiveness. Our third issue is value for money. All right, and that's what, and we're responding. And this is what we do. And this is the logos of our 28 national organizations, large and small: cancers, heart conditions, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's, Parkinson's, hypertension. that's me, and a whole bunch of others. All right, so a broad spectrum of Canadian patient interest there. As has been said very articulately, there aren't enough of us in Canada, or from our perspective, there are too many of you to be an adequate and reliable supply of prescription medicines for your very large market. We're 2% of the spend in the world on prescription medicines. You're 44%. That's just not enough to be a sustainable supply of medicines for Americans. Simple. I'm one of those on medicines. These are my 7. They're my medications. I need them to stay alive. You can't have them. As a friend, you can't have them. All right? I'm not the only Canadian who feels that way. Actually, before Secretary Azar announced publicly the intent to try to develop rules for a couple of pathways, a coalition of groups, including Best Medicines, wrote to our Minister of Health saying, I think we got a problem here, and we want to meet. That led to a meeting with the minister and her officials, and that led to a follow-up. And this is the final slide from a briefing, technical briefing we had from the Health Canada, and it says that all options available to the government to respond to the issue are being considered. All options. And the government is committed to improving the accessibility and the affordability. And there's one example of one of the tools in the toolbox. A specific law that was introduced but not passed in 2005 to give the Minister of Health authority to collect information, to require disclosure, to impose rules and conditions, and if necessary to ban bulk imports of drugs from Canada to the United States. Pretty simple. By the way, there's a lot of people in Canada who take prescription medicines, and they have a lot of relatives and friends and neighbors, and we're all voters, and we're in the middle of a federal election in Canada. Voting day is October 21. And we're going to hold, and all the political leaders in Canada are saying, no, Canadian medicines produced and intended and packaged to be for Canadians, to maintain our health and well-being, are top priority. We're going to protect those medicines and that supply chain. All right, so we have responded to Secretary Azar's proposals. Looking forward to a meeting tomorrow morning with some of his senior officials to have a full and frank exchange of views. And we have written to them, and we want the government to be, actually the statement today through the embassy from Global Affairs Canada is the most clear-cut, specific, in-writing statement we've had. There have been scrums in the election campaign with reporters, but now there it is. So, we're dear friends. By the way, you're all federal taxpayers. I want to say thank you. Keep paying your federal taxes, because those taxes go to fund a knowledge factory called the National Institutes of Health. My son with a rare genetic condition is a direct beneficiary of the basic science research that was done at the National Institutes of Health that was then commercialized by a biotech startup from California and has made a huge difference in his mental function and his physical well-being. So thank you very much for paying your federal taxes. Keep doing it. All right?
Thank you, John.
All right? I think that's
Don?
it.
You know, I have one question for you, John, while you're finding your seat. I have heard advocates of importation from Canada suggest that companies in Canada can just ramp up production of medicines in Canada to account for increased demand from the Americans. How does that jibe with what you know, and what kind of shortage problem do you have today?
Right. 2 points. We actually don't manufacture medicines in Canada. With a few very rare exceptions. We get them from the United States or from abroad, so we don't have any tools in our toolbox in Canada to ramp up production, and there are others who make those decisions globally. And in terms of, we already have, by the way, a drug shortage problem. I suffer from high blood pressure. I'm on a cocktail of 3 medications. My father had 2 cardiac events. I have 0. I want to keep taking those medications. My first medication is no longer available. It's out of supply. There are lots of Canadians, and Pharmacists in Canada are spending 20% of their time navigating shortages of drug supply for their patients. So please don't make it worse.
Don?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's always good to speak right after lunch. My name's Don Bell. I spent over 30 years in law enforcement, both in the policing with the state police and with the Canada Border Service Agency. I was a senior executive in both roles, and my expertise is the nexus where organized crime and illicit drugs intersect. You know, I think it's been carefully documented that Canada's supply chain is very safe, and our brick and mortar operation is certainly sets a standard for us. But it should be recognized too that drug supply chain was built for the safety of Canadians and for the domestic market. It was not built to ensure the safety of other nations, and that includes the United States. And while we recognize our international responsibilities and we're cognizant of those, we certainly cannot take the responsibility or the accountability, and our services are commissioned for the protection of Canadians. There are three organizations that take a part in the drug supply chain and the import and export of pharmaceuticals, that being Health Canada, who has oversight, Canada Border Service, who looks after things coming and going, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who look after the enforcement side of things. But I can say that it is not a routine inspection for the Canada Border Service Agency to inspect outgoing pharmaceuticals. Incoming pharmaceuticals are put through a rigorous test. Outgoing are not, regardless of whether they're made in Canada or a transshipment point. And this issue is worsened, when it is a transshipment and it does come through the international mail systems in Canada. And numerous online pharmacies are already waving the Canadian flag to take advantage of some of these loopholes. And in fact, these websites are likely not to even be part of Canada or part of our supply chain. And in fact, the pharmaceuticals that are being sold by these websites are likely not even to touch Canadian soil. And that's problematic. The focus of our inspectors remains on domestic use, and there are three tiers, tier 1 being the priority, tier 2 the second, tier 3 the next, and tier 3 is where pharmaceuticals fall into play. And unless there's a tip or a tag to an organized crime or suspect drug, they're not going to be examined on a routine basis. Let's take a look at an operation called Operation Pangaea. As I said before, we don't have the capacity to look at online market. However, Interpol has a project that takes place every October where they focus on the online sale of counterfeit and illicit medicines and devices. And the message of Operation Pangaea is don't risk your health by importing fake health products. So in Canada, and the numbers are pretty repetitive, but over the 8-day blitz, generally there's about 3,700 to 4,000 packages inspected. 90% of these are either refused or seized as a result of being counterfeit or substandard. If you take that 8 days and expand those seizures over 365 days or a year, that's over 150,000 packages. And the estimated value of these illegal or substandard drugs is approximately $38 million. What's the point of this analysis? Well, simply, there already exists a significant counterfeit problem in Canada. There already exists a significant problem in the United States. People are being tricked, and it's a major health and public safety concern. Opening the door with this proposed legislation will only exacerbate the problem. Organized crime. Greed drives bad actors, and at the end we'll all pay for this. If the legislation is passed, Canada's supply chain will be depleted. And Marv has given the statistics on that, and it will happen quite quickly. And criminals will take advantage of this loophole. And this is already being fueled, as I said, by online pharmacies. And they will exploit the Canadian supply chain, which actually has no nexus to Canada. I'm going to give you an example of a case that actually took place in Western Canada. And this was a group of high school buddies. We're not talking, traditional mafia or the Hells Angels. This is kids that grew up in school and saw an opportunity to make money. They set up a supply chain that went through the United States into the Mexican cartels and back. And during this investigation, the police seized a pill press, and we've talked a lot about pill presses, but this particular pill press was capable of producing 18,000 pills in an hour. In Canada, you can import a kilo of fentanyl from China for $12,000. A kilo will produce 500,000 2-milligram pills. A pill will sell for $20 to $40. The street value for your $12,000 investment is $10 to $20 million. That's what attracts organized crime into it. That's why the loophole is going to be filled, and simple supply and demand will dictate that this is going to happen. Finally, I'd like to wrap up by saying a recent police investigation, which did involve the Hells Angels and did involve cross-border into the state of Connecticut and did involve fentanyl. Unfortunately, we do share a border and we do share the opioid crisis. In Canada, we're losing 11 people a day, 4,000 people a year, which is about on par to what the Americans are facing. But in Canada, very rarely will a senior executive announce evidence in a press conference. But it was felt that it was important for the public to know that drug traffickers were talking on wires on their phone that was intercepted by the police, stating that the money to be made is far too great to worry about human life. So if in fact the legislation is to afford Americans the opportunity to buy cheaper drugs, there's nothing wrong with that. If the legislation is to provide safety, then I would suggest that the cost of human life, the cost to our communities, and the cost of families far outweighs any saving you'll get in purchasing the drugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. So we are a little pressed for time, so I want to make sure you know that we're available to do interviews or meetings at a later time. We'll be here, except for Don who has to leave tonight, we'll all be here today and tomorrow. We can come by your office or do even a phone meeting with you. But because of time pressure, I want to get the next panel up here. And thank you to my panelists for your help explaining the issue.
Our second panel this afternoon is led by a gentleman who we've been friends for many, 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 many years, Charlie Sion of the National Drug Diversion Investigators Association. And NADDI trains law enforcement officers all around the country in the dangers of illegal and unsafe drugs. So let me turn it over to Charlie and he can introduce the panel.
Thank you, Marv. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. NADDI's been around. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. Been educating and training law enforcement, community organizations, physicians, pharmacists, nurses about drug diversion, abuse, counterfeit drugs for over 30 years. We're going to bring up Andrea first. You met Andrea earlier when she stood up, and unfortunately we had a photograph of her daughter Ashley. So Andrea's daughter passed away from a combination of oxycodone and fentanyl. This wasn't made by any of our pharmaceutical manufacturers in the U.S. This was made by a pill press. That included the fentanyl that Marv talked about. And I know he talked about a chocolate chip cookie, but I use the analogy of it's like making a cake without any type of cookbook in front of you. And it's not 1 grain of fentanyl, they're putting the whole salt shaker in there. So we don't know how much our kids or anybody that's getting it from a friend, purchasing for $20 or $30, buying it for the internet, is actually getting. And it's a hard stopping pill. And unfortunately, we're losing too many young children. We were fortunate enough as an organization to partner with the Partnerships to Save Medicine and the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy recently with probably the best white paper that came out concerning pill presses. And that's on the Partnership for Safe Medicine's website and NADDI's website. Andrea and Deanne Hopkins, the Voices of Awareness of Foundation in Colorado, have been working since her daughter's death to raise awareness about substance abuse, addiction, and prevention in their community. And I'd like to bring up Andrea to talk about, unfortunately, what her family and she went through in her daughter's death. And really the only question that I'd like her to answer and talk to you about is if we're doing enough, if you're doing enough, and what more can we do to prevent other children from dying?
Hello. Like Charlie had mentioned, these counterfeits that are laced with fentanyl can take lives very quickly. So in my daughter's case, I'm told that the half of pill that she ingested killed her almost instantly. It stopped her heart, it stopped her breathing, and she was gone. So normally, for Voices for Awareness, the foundation that Deanne and I have, we speak about education to these issues and safety measures all the time. But today is different because these other mothers are here, and we sit in the same shoes. And so even though there are only a handful of these mothers in the room, think of how many thousands more are out there that we haven't heard from. In answer to Charlie's question, if I feel like we're doing enough, as a parent, no, I don't feel like we're doing enough. My daughter's death was preventable. As a parent of a child murdered by a counterfeit, I would say that these other parents that have never received justice for their children and may never. In my daughter's case, I am very fortunate in the fact that there were 5 federal indictments in place right now for my daughter's death, for her murder. The pills that were brought into the United States were alleged to just be walked across the border. So even the day after my daughter died, and I live in a small rural community, I have about 200,000, there's about 200,000 residents in Grand Junction. So you know just about everybody that you pass in our area. We made my daughter's death very public because we wanted to make sure that people knew not to take these blue pills. But even after that, the day after my daughter's death, this person allegedly went back across the border and brought more pills in. Of course, he didn't take them himself because he knew they were killing people. In this case, for my daughter, there are 8 counterfeit charges that are added to a list of many, many more charges. This is rare, fortunate for us in this case, but in all the counterfeit deaths in the state of Colorado, there are not many counterfeit charges prosecuted. My daughter's may be the first for a fentanyl counterfeit, or a counterfeit that's laced with fentanyl. That seems crazy to me. Counterfeits, as a parent, I believe, should have a stiffer penalty, even beyond a Schedule I drug. These are the worst drugs that are out there. Counterfeits that could be if you had cancer and you were giving your child a cancer drug that was making no difference to them and allowing them to die, or if you got a hold of a counterfeit drug that was laced with fentanyl and killed you instantly. To me, that should have the stiffest penalty that there is. There needs to be a deterrent for these drugs. Like Don said, if a group of teenagers can get a hold of a pill press and make these drugs on their own, what happens when you get a bag of fentanyl or a kilo of fentanyl and put it into the right hands? These are drugs that can be used for mass destruction. And we know about this. So as a parent, I would say, no, Charlie, I don't think that we're doing enough about this. And we have first responders and law enforcement that work very hard for us. And we have to protect them and we have to educate them. Ashley was alleged to be the 12th person and a long list of people that passed from the same bag of pills. I never heard about any of the others. Our first responders and law enforcement need to be educated on how to determine which of these pills are counterfeits, and need the backing to be able to follow through with prosecution. So I hope that all of these are things that you really think about today, not just a couple of parents that are coming forth and speaking, but there's thousands and thousands of us out there. Thank you.
Armando, if you make your way up to the podium, I'll do a quick introduction. Our next panel member is a 12-year veteran of the Drug Enforcement Administration and currently is the lead investigator for Bristol-Myers Squibb for the illegal, illicit, counterfeit drug trade in the Americas. I know we've been talking about opioids, we've been talking about pain medications and pill mills and pill presses, but Armando is going to be talking about life-saving medications that are also being counterfeited and entering into our supply chain into the U.S.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Great. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Partnership for Safe Medicines for inviting us to this important discussion, and thanking you guys for being here and listening to everybody in this panel, because it's a very important issue. So I work for BMS, Bristol-Myers Squibb. It's one of the big pharmaceutical companies in the U.S. But here I could be talking on behalf of every pharmaceutical company, because we all have this problem. If it's a medication, it's been counterfeited because it makes money. And like it's been said here, these criminal organizations, they don't care about anything else but to make money, regardless if it kills people or not. So I have a few cases to discuss with you guys. First case, this case is an ongoing case right now going on in Mexico. So Opdivo, it's one of our products, BMS. It's an oncology biologic product. It's prescribed for multiple types of cancer. So in this case, we have two patients, one an adult patient and one an adolescent. We started receiving complaints specifically because one of the patients who had been in remission, the cancer had returned, and they didn't know why. In the second case, in the case of the adolescent, and so it's an interesting fact that we're talking about making money, right? So in the case of the adolescent, it's a very poor family from Mexico, and they went to an NGO, and the NGO donated 2 units. So the first time the patient got the first donation, the mother immediately realized the packaging was in English. Well, this is Mexico. Mexican law prohibits packaging to be in any other language than Spanish. So that was the first key. So she went back to the NGO and said, hey, your guy just gave me a product that is in English pack. And so the NGO referred her to another distributor. And the second unit came, and guess what? Same thing. So the investigation has revealed that they were using an NGO. They were giving donated product that was counterfeit. Fortunately for that kid, we were able to replace that product, and he was not infused. Unfortunately for the other patient, he got 8 dosage units, so 8 treatments of counterfeit product, and he's the one that the cancer has shown that has come back. So when they were confronted, the NGO was confronted, and these 2 individuals were identified, the ones that supplied the counterfeit. They issued this letter. They came up with this letter from the Cross Cancer Institute from Alberta, Canada. It's nothing but a fake letter to justify why they were bringing English packs to Mexico. And if you read the letter, it's sort of a crazy thing. Product that had been donated in Singapore that a cancer institute in Canada somehow got a hold of and then sent to Mexico to be donated to patients. And half of the letter it's in Spanish and half in English, so you can tell that. And by the way, it's signed by the Secretary General of the United Nations to give validity to it. So we were able to identify the people. We referred the case to the Mexican authorities. Unfortunately, Mexico does not have the type of rules and controls that we have here. So it's not very easy to make a case in Mexico. So the people that were involved here are still out there doing what they're doing. The other case, this is not a product from Bristol Myers Squibb. It's a product from another company. This case is from Colombia. This is a 2-3 year investigation. This involves Survanta. Survanta is a medication that treats a respiratory distress syndrome on premature babies. So the first case, cancer patients. Second case, premature babies. In this case, the investigation indicates that a criminal organization went to Venezuela. As you may know, Venezuela is in turmoil right now. There's hardly any controls, any law enforcement activities. It's basically no. What it's believed that they acquire expired product, smuggled it into Colombia. We don't know for sure, but I'm almost convinced that the way they smuggled it is not following good distribution practices. I've been involved in prior cases where they have actually inserted product inside the engines of trucks. Now, that's a product that requires cold chain. So you got to keep it under very strict controls, temperature controls. So anyhow, the product was brought into Colombia, was repackaged, relabeled, now with a new expiration date. Now it's good to go. And they sold it to some clinics and for some government-sponsored hospitals. So how do we know? Was it discovered? Because 16 children died at one specific clinic. And obviously, after so many people or babies started dying, then there was an investigation. At a personal level, what is frustrating to me, that's not my investigation. But 7 years ago, I had a very similar investigation with that same clinic where those children died. And I used to work for another company. We filed a complaint. We identified the whole structure scheme. And for whatever reason, nothing was done. 7 years later, we have a whole bunch of premature babies that died. And we only know about one clinic. We don't know about other clinics. A very interesting fact that was told to me by the investigator, that they know of one government hospital was paying twice the amount that company would have charged them if they had bought from the manufacturer. So this is all about money. In that case, the director of purchasing from that hospital was getting a kickback. He was paying twice the amount that he could have paid if they had bought it from the legitimate manufacturer. 20 people were arrested. 19 of them are serving house arrest. What do you think they're doing today? They're counterfeiting products. That's all they know how to do. Sprycel, it's one of BMS's products. It's an oncology product. It's used to treat myeloid leukemia. This very recent case in Mexico. We had 2 patients. We have a male in his 60s, and we have an adolescent. We started receiving complaints because this is kind of a weird case where the common denominator is the lot number in the bottle, yet one of the bottles had capsules, dark capsules, are the tablets. Sprycels are round, white tablets. So that patient was able to go back to the doctor, and the doctor said immediately, don't take it, because obviously that's not the original product. Months down the road, we have an adolescent patient who also goes to the same doctor. And that was the key. We were fortunate there. So the doctor noticed that after testing the adolescent male, that the cancer had returned. He had been under remission for 3 years, and all of a sudden, cancer is back. Leukemia was back. So the doctor asked to see the bottle. And immediately the doctor said, that's the same lot number as the other patient. But in this case, the tablets were exactly the same as the original ones. So that's why we know that. And like I said, he has the cancer has returned. Important fact here, the whole distribution chain was legitimate. So in one of the cases, the actual distributor was one of our own authorized distributors. My investigation then revealed that they didn't buy it from us. They went to a gray market operator and bought it for a third of the price that BMS would sell to their best distributors, which would be the cheapest that you can buy in Mexico. They were buying it at a third. Nobody in that supply chain ever raised a red flag. So unfortunately, money plays a big factor here. And the last case I would like to go over with you involves a Canadian wholesaler. Sorry. So a few years ago in the US, this Canadian wholesaler called TC Medical started bombarding infusion centers with faxes offering discounted medications, not only from BMS, from every pharmaceutical company. But specifically, they were offering Orencia. Orencia, it's a product that is used for rheumatoid arthritis. So the way the scheme worked was they were blasting people with faxes, offering ridiculous prices. So the infusion centers or clinics here in the US would order to the company in Canada, who then would order product from Turkey. And from Turkey, the product was sent to the United States, but not to the customer who actually originally requested the product, but to third parties that were working on behalf of TC Medical. So those people would receive the product, store it. How did the product arrive from Turkey? Who knows? How is the product kept or shipped to the final destination? Who knows? But what we know, it was not kept under the proper conditions because a lot of the product had to be returned because it was warm, and that is a temperature control product. We also know that a bunch of patients had to go to emergency rooms because they were having adverse reactions after being infused with some of these medications. Therefore, the medication was no good. That wholesaler was properly registered in Canada, but not in the US. So after a 3-year investigation and working with OCI, FDA OCI, the Office of Criminal Investigations, you would see at the bottom here what they were doing. They were ripping the part of the box, the packaging, because that's where we could track where that unit had been sold originally. So they would remove that. Part of the problem was also that they encountered that a lot of nurses in the US refused to infuse the product that they were supplying because they couldn't understand the instructions on the packaging. So the bottom line is that 3 years later, OCI filed charges, and I'm happy to say that the CEO of TC Medical was indicted and was extradited to the US and served a 26-month prison sentence and had to pay like $45 million fine and had to relinquish $30 additional million. The problem is this: 30, 45, that's $75 million. This was a $1.5 billion operation. So if we just find them, that's the cost of doing business for them. So when they were confronted, this is what they did. They used to send a letter to their customers saying, hey, the reason we're able to provide cheap products to use because we work directly with these pharmaceutical companies. No, that was not so. That was a lie. And if you went to their website, you see there the list of the companies that they claim to be partners with. We never had any relationship with them. But people were tempted by the prices. So my message here is, it's bad enough that people have to die for counterfeits, but there's a whole bunch of other people that we don't know why they died, because if you're in a hospital or you go to an infusion center, you trust that they're buying from the legitimate sources. We don't know. We don't know how many people with cancer or other diseases have died because they were given counterfeits or drugs that were not handled properly. Thank you very much.
The bad guys have taken advantage of the opioid epidemic that we have in the United States by providing more powerful drugs on the street with the additive fentanyl. Our next panel speaker is Mark Bellman. Mark is a 35-year law enforcement veteran, retired from the Drug Enforcement Administration, also retired captain from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. So what happens when 6 teenagers show up at your county hospital on a Saturday morning overdosed from a narcotic? Who's responding? What law enforcement agency is going to handle it? Mark's going to talk about a huge case that began with just the purchase of 2 pills on the street in Pinellas County.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. And I appreciate representing Partnership for Safe Medicines. It's a great organization. It's meaningful, and it's very powerful, and it's going in the right direction every day. And also of the ladies here, of the survivors of the victims here that are so courageous in what they're doing. They've taken pain and grief, and they've turned it around and pointed it in the right direction to pursue the right path of getting people away from this type of stuff. Today I'm going to talk about a domestic drug case that was done in Pinellas County, Florida, where I used to work. Let me go back here a second. Oh, too far. Operation Top Dog Hot Dog. Again, as Charlie just said, it started out as a local investigation in Pinellas County where there were some undercover buys made and some controlled buys made by confidential informants. The pills that were sold were represented as oxycodones and Percocets. The benefit that Pinellas County SO has that a lot of agencies don't have is Pinellas County has their own lab, so they can do forensic analysis rather quickly. They took the pills over within a 2-day period. They turned the analysis around and were able to determine there was fentanyl in the 2 dosage units that were misrepresented when they were sold by the bad guy. So immediately, the detectives and the agents who were working collectively together on it realized the urgency of trying to address this, knowing that these individuals in the undercover conversations had the capability of distributing significant amounts of these counterfeit dosage units. So they immediately went out and grabbed up one of the guys who had sold and flipped them right away. Typically that's how drug cases work. You use people and you try to gain their cooperation by hopefully they're going to try to mitigate what they're looking at. They in turn provided information against the 2 main people. Thus came the name Operation Top Dog Hot Dog, because the 2 main guys were running a hot dog stand. They had 2 separate ones actually. And you can see that they had this side business. The hot dog stands were merely there as a prop. If you ever go into Home Depot and see the hot dog guy out front, he's not making a lot of money. These guys were killing it. They were making a ton of money. And you can see the money up there in the corner. You can see the apparatus of the pill presses. You can see the processing done by the detectives down here. Once they determine it's fentanyl, it's just as dangerous to the first responders and law enforcement. We can't touch it. We can't inhale it. We can't have anything to do with this. This stuff's going to poison us, and we know it. We have to be able, to take care of the transfer of custody and package it the right way and send it on for analysis. The worst part is when guys do undercover, guys and girls, excuse me, they can't touch it either. They may be thinking they're buying a Percocet or a oxycodone, but they're careful on how they receive it from the bad guy because, again, it could have fentanyl in it. And in this case, they were very careful on how they did these undercover transactions. So you can see it's all about being in the money. In the upper corner there, you can see the cash. That was just a sampling of the cash that they'd taken out of one of the residences. And you can see some of the finished product and fentanyl powder over here. All total, this is what we ended up seizing in this investigation. Bolded in red are two really significant things. Number one, there was 5 pill presses that had the capability of producing thousands of dosage units within an hour, roughly anywhere between 10 to 15,000 dosage units. Again, the amount of money, the significant amount of fentanyl that was actually seized was over 5 kilograms. As my good friend Don Bell said, you do the math here. These guys are making tons of money. There's no coke dealer making this kind of money. Trust me, they're killing it with these counterfeit substances. All the pills that were seized in this case, everything was represented to by the bad guys to the people that were buying it as either Percocet or oxycodone. They never were told it was fentanyl. People would buy it thinking they were getting Percocet or they were getting oxycodone. And in some cases, obviously, that were the case. And with these victims here, of these loved ones here that are here right now, not knowing, there's no knowledge of it. You don't know what you're getting here, right? Again, look at the asset seizures here. Over $1 million in cash, over $500,000 in properties, guns, everything that's typical of a drug trafficking organization. The sad part is, this is a very normal drug trafficking organization in the United States now. They exist not just in Florida, they're all throughout all of our 50 states. We have similar type organizations doing the exact same thing. Why? Because you can go on the internet, you can buy a pill press. Not illegal. You can go on the internet, buy a pill press, get it shipped to you, send it to a reshipper, have it dropped off at a drop location to make sure. Don't pick it up right away, sit on it a while, make sure there's some surveillance so no one follows you. The bad guys figure it out. Likewise, you can go on the internet through the dark web and you can purchase a kilogram or less of fentanyl, depending on how much money you want to spend. Again, we've already covered the numbers on the price of fentanyl. So a little bit of fentanyl, a kilogram of fentanyl, you have the pills, you have the pill press. In some instances, the pill press, the stamps come, or the markings and the scoring comes to make it look like what we need it to look like, be it Percocet, be it tramadol, whatever it is. Some of them are benzodiazepines, some of them are actually Schedule II narcotics that are represented, but they all have a certain amount of fentanyl. The fentanyl has a clumping consistency to it, so when it's pressed into the pills, it's not like these guys that are manufacturing it clandestinely are using their due diligence to make sure a certain amount gets in each dosage unit. So that's why people drop over dead instantly from it. One pill kills, no doubt about it. It happens. So, like I said, these type of investigations, they exist all over the United States. This is a disruption to a domestic dismantlement, but it's not totally dismantled because the real bad guys are sitting over in China, right? They're the ones who are manufacturing it. They're the ones who are shipping it over here. They're successfully getting it here. And unfortunately, we don't have an extradition treaty with China. So the only way we're going to get these bad guys out of China is we do a Department of Justice approved lure, meaning we get them to come to another country and we try to grab them up and take them into custody or help with the help of our counterparts. Or they get red noses put on them and they get into a international database where the warrants pop up and they get grabbed somewhere if they step out of China. That rarely happens. These people know they've been indicted. All right, and so they're going to continue to send the fentanyl over. At the upper level of the Chinese government, their response to the United States is, this is your problem. DEA does work on case-by-case basis sometimes, does work well with the Chinese authorities. Did you ever hear, it's kind of similar because I've lived long enough and been in DEA long enough over almost 40 years that when we at the height of the cocaine wars with the Colombians, we were told the same thing by Colombia. Hey, this is your problem. This isn't our problem. Well, their chickens came home to roost because now they have a drug problem in Colombia as well. It's only a matter of time. That'll happen. So, to China probably as well. We have to stop it. We have to stop the epidemic of it, and we have to stop the flow of fentanyl into the U.S., and we also have to stop the pill presses. I'm hoping that there'll be some legislation passed, just like our congressional representative here represented, that we're going to charge somebody with these pill presses. There's no reason why somebody should legally have a pill press that has the capability of pressing out tens of thousands of dosage units hourly. I don't care what kind of supplement are you pressing out. That's the question. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Take care.
While Shabbir makes his way up here for some closing remarks, I just want to thank the family members. Oh, I'm sorry, Marv's coming up for closing remarks. I want to thank the family members who came today to share their stories with us, and the staffers that came and listened to the stories. And we just hope you take back some information to your office that could help us. Marv?
Thank you. Well, I hope it's been a good learning experience for you. And as Charlie said, take it back home, take it to the office, and work with it, and work with the law enforcement and other people involved with it. I got a little side note. Was the last year we were talking about pill presses, and there was a gentleman in the audience who was a staffer for a legislator, and that legislator wanted to pass some laws on who could access pill presses, and he called me three times. We talked about who should be a licensed pill press owner, and manufacturers being one of them and everything. But he got so much, I guess, friction from other organizations, and I couldn't figure out what other organizations would be against this law. And then he finally told me, he says, it was the supplemental industry, the people making the vitamins and that they didn't want anybody stopping them from buying pill presses. I thought it was the candy industry, because a lot of candy industry makes candy with pill presses. That's what I thought, but I didn't realize it was supplemental pill presses. And the fruition never came about. We never was introduced the law, and it just finally stopped because of the pressure from the other industry involved with it. Kind of politics. You folks have a good trip home. Be safe. Stay away from buying that bad drugs off the streets. Yeah. Shabbir, you want anything to say?
Have a nice day.
Yeah, have a nice day. Thank you for coming.